Hello and welcome to Gladio Free Europe. I am Liam, joined here as always by the incredible Russian Sam.
Hello, hello.
And today we have a very special guest, our friend John Bellamy Poster, who's here for a really, really exciting discussion that's been a long time in the works. We are returning to one of our great subjects of interest over the last couple months. That would be the history of Japan, especially as it pertains to the island of Hokkaido in the far north of Japan. John, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Liam and Sam. I'm a big fan of the pod.
Oh, I'm very glad to hear it. It's gonna be really fun. You are more familiar with some of these aspects of Japanese history than we are. Before we start, do you mind talking about, John, about what first, sparked this interest in Japan and Hokkaido in particular?
Yeah, well, like many people in the US, I've long been a fan maybe of, sort of Japanese culture in a very shallow sense, sort of anime and manga, at least going back to, elementary, middle school. I grew up in San Francisco, which has a very large Japanese American population. And so, being exposed to it in that way, I think was interesting. But I've also just in general long been a history fan in general. Mm-hmm. When I was, maybe not in middle school at a certain point, I started to wonder, it's like, okay, well, what's going on with sort of the history of this country that's producing all of this, incredibly popular media internationally. And it's, it's an extremely interesting country. Historically, it's part of the G7. And I think as we were discussing in our sort of pre-recording talk, has a really interesting history in terms of how quickly it modernized and became an imperial power after its sort of, forced opening. Right.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, it's this incredibly effective case of if you can't beat them, join them. And, and I think that on that point about pop culture, I remember one thing that I kind of first thought about when I was maybe 15 or 16 is it is really strange that Japanese pop culture is so prominent, but other large Asian countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia have nothing comparable, either in like their cultural output to American viewers or just general awareness of their history or the, geopolitical relevance of their economies. And I think that, many Japanese people believe that Japan has taken a very unique historical course. And I think there's nothing to that. But I think that if we want to look at why Japan had such a different outcome, of course, across its 19th and 20th century development, of course, ultimately culminating in, World War II and its eventual basically subjugation by the US, I think we really want to start earlier with kind of what happened to Japan, basically why Japan took this unique course. And that's why I was thinking that looking at the specific colonization of Hokkaido, the northernmost island, which we've talked about earlier last month, and how it's the homeland of the Ainu people, the indigenous people of Hokkaido. But how in 1869, after centuries of de facto subjugation, it was finally formally annexed into the country. And I think the conquest of Hokkaido is so interesting because it was just fundamentally connected to the modernization of Japan, to the process of the Meiji Restoration, when a new government came in and very, very rapidly began modernizing the country and basically reshaping political institutions on Western models. And nowhere was this more extreme than on Hokkaido.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting because the, sort of pre-Meiji Restoration and sort of through the course of the Boshin War, when Japan has its civil war, mm-hmm. it's viewed as kind of an unusual one amongst maybe like bourgeois revolutions because it had a relatively low number of casualties. In spite of being a civil war, not an enormous number of people died.
Yeah, contrast it with the English Civil War, for instance.
Yeah, this was a much more straightforward case of elite replacement rather than like a mass civil outburst.
It was closer to a coup, I would say. And then one thing that we talked about before, John, in planning this, is that another really kind of interesting thing about it is how, unlike the English Civil War, for instance, it was seen as this reassertion of monarchical power. Of course, it was supposedly this restoration. I think that whether or not the monarch of Japan, the emperor, actually got much more power, I think that's kind of debatable, or whether it really was just another kind of bourgeois revolution, with this kind of monarchist guise. But it definitely saw itself as a very different kind of revolution than the, bourgeois revolutions of 19th century Europe.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd say you could argue it was in some sense a bit of both. When you're trying to establish an empire, it doesn't hurt to have this figure of an emperor, But on the flip side, as Sam was mentioning, in some sense, this was sort of a coup. Maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, but it's a bit interesting because many of the forces which were sort of pivotal in winning the Civil War were ones which in the previous kind of feudal period were more marginal.
Yes.
If you think of sort of the various rankings of domains under the shogunate, it was, the regions of sort of Choshu, Satsuma, which were maybe the farthest kind of to the southwest and, more marginal from the center of Japan, which were really pivotal in winning the war.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The regional character is so interesting. 100%. Just like you saw, it's kind of the reverse of what we talked about in our episodes on the Sengoku period, how you see the shift of power move to the northeast from Kyoto to Edo. It's kind of the opposite here. But so we've kind of gone long enough for really getting into this. One thing that we really have to mention, really the kind of fundamental thing here that really gave us the idea for this episode, is that, John, you are a big fan of a very interesting work of fiction, bringing this back to pop culture. This specifically is this very popular recent manga with now an ongoing anime series called Golden Kamuy, which I don't think we've mentioned on the podcast before, but I've been interested in for a while because the fact that it is a historical manga, which is not as common as you might expect, specifically set in a very unusual time and place, that being the island of Hokkaido in the early 20th century, very shortly after the Russo-Japanese War. This great climactic confrontation between Japan and the closest European power. And we're going to talk a lot about that competition this episode. And we're hoping next episode to really go further in depth into that war itself. But let's talk about Golden Kamuy, because I gotta say, I wasn't able to finish it so far. I've read about a third of it. It is a really fun, really exciting manga.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting story, and I'd even sort of almost doubly recommend it to maybe people who aren't already fans of anime or manga.
Oh, absolutely. It's a great intro, yes, to the medium.
And one reason for that is because I think it might avoid a lot of the tropes or issues people might find with the genre, yes, but it's also just sort of independently extremely interesting. Yeah. I think this is the kind of story which, as you say, despite sort of being a work of historical fiction, it's very, very heavily grounded in history. It's clear that the author, spends a lot of time researching.
Oh, absolutely. And also in Ainu culture as well, there's a really it seems a generally respectful depiction of Ainu society with a really serious interest in getting these cultural traditions right.
Absolutely. And in fact, even sort of incorporating them in many ways into the narrative. So it's sort of interesting, though, because I think, as you also mentioned, it's not just sort of an unusual period of history. It's not even sort of a very common time period for other anime or manga. Mm-hmm. There are quite a few which tend to be set during the Meiji Revolution, like we were just alluding to. I mean, civil wars are always fun to depict in history.
And which just to ground this here, if people aren't familiar, we're going to go into the course of the history of the Meiji Restoration, but really it's the late 1860s. And so basically immediately after the American Civil War, Japan has its own much less bloody civil war to establish its own kind of modern political order, just like America did.
Yeah. But in this case, this story sort of begins, maybe in the middle of
50 years later.
Yeah. Maybe in the middle of, or maybe right after the Russo-Japanese War, which is around 1904, 1905. One of the sort of main characters of the story is actually based on the author's grandfather, who was himself a veteran of the war. Mm-hmm. So our sort of heroic protagonist, Sugimoto Saichi, is maybe a common, sort of manga character you might expect. He's a fearless badass sort of who laughs in the face of death.
Yeah. So he's a guy named Sugimoto the Immortal who was constantly having these incredibly brutal encounters with the Russians, but he always managed to survive. He might have gotten a lot of bad scars along the way, but he would always beat his enemies. He's just like Guts from Berserk, if you're familiar. Basically traumatized badass who we find out has this very sympathetic, very kind of sad backstory that explains his motivation for kind of finding the MacGuffin of Golden Kamuy, which is specifically this cache of buried treasure. And just like something like One Piece, really the engine of Golden Kamuy is about these different characters, all very colorful, who are searching for this buried treasure somewhere on Hokkaido. And what really kind of sets this one apart is the means by which these characters can't find that treasure.
Exactly. So in the story, the treasure was initially actually gathered by various groups of Ainu throughout Hokkaido, with the intention of maybe gathering it as a cache to use to perhaps wage some kind of war against the Japanese colonizers. At some point, they're betrayed, the gold is stolen, and it falls into the hands of some convicts who themselves are captured by the Japanese government. The convicts have hidden the gold somewhere, and it's not clear where, but one of the members who's sort of trapped in prison, he has hidden a map which reveals the location of the gold. But the map is not in...
But not just any
exactly.
map.
It's not in a single piece, and it's not written in paper, but instead tattooed onto the skins of other convicts who have agreed to help him find it if they ever escape.
Right. And so, and speaking of tattoos, Sugimoto quickly teams up with this little Ainu girl. This is probably like 13. They never say her age. She's probably like 13 or 14. She's like a young teenager who, it turns out, is in fact the daughter of one of those Ainu men who was betrayed and killed in the hiding of this treasure. Her name is Serpa. And she's a fun character. You kind of see this kind of like tough little girl in Japanese media before. There's a lot of interest in that kind of a character, but she's fun. She's got a lot of personality. And so she and Sugimoto become this team searching for the treasure. She kind of wants to avenge the betrayal of her father, and Sugimoto, he wants to make some money to give to the family or the widow of a friend of his from the Russo-Japanese War. So this unlikely pair, this kind of traumatized veteran and this like very tough little, very short little girl work together. And so there's a lot of bear hunts, a lot of encounters with the various, colorful figures of Hokkaido. It also turns out that she's very good friends with a wolf. And before we started, I was kind of asking John if this is a direct kind of ripoff of Princess Mononoke, the little girl with the wolf, or if this is just boss baby syndrome. Where I'm not familiar enough with Japanese media, so that's the first thing comparison that comes to mind.
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, it is a very iconic image of this fierce warrior woman who's friends with wolves. Maybe raised by them, but without maybe getting too much into the story, I'll say that wolves play a heavy thematic role, and maybe that shouldn't be surprising because they were Kamui of such importance in Ainu culture in Hokkaido. Yes,
and Kamui meaning God. As we talked before about how in the worldview of the Ainu, which is still a religion that's still practiced today, Ainu people believe that the spirits of gods reside in many wild animals, and that the most vibrant expression of this is in the Itomante ceremony that we discussed, where every year a bear cub is taken from the den of its mother, raised, and then eventually ritually sacrificed to be kind of sent back to the realm of the gods. One thing that comes up a lot in Golden Kamuy is the way that an animal may become basically possessed by the spirit of an evil god, which happens if ever it kills someone. There's a lot of discussion about man-eating bears, and there's a lot of fear that if this one wolf, I believe his name is Retar, the wolf of a Serpa, her like pet, basically her friend, if he ever kills somebody, that's really bad news.
Yeah.
He becomes an evil god.
It's maybe not surprising in a story that's filled with veterans, convicts, and all manner of sort of violent people. A heavy theme in the story is sort of both the cycle of violence and how it can kind of psychologically or spiritually harm you, but also maybe perhaps the need to foment violence, perhaps to protect your homeland from being colonized. It's certainly understandable.
Right. And so we're going to discuss more about the kind of the plot of Golden Kamuy and the characters as we go over the course of Japanese history up here, and this will kind of come in naturally. But before we get into that history, which is going to be the bulk of this episode, a couple things I think we probably should talk about. So number one, Golden Kamuy, obviously, it's a Japanese manga largely depicting non-Japanese cultures. I know you were saying it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of like its own version of Orientalism that way, with the depiction of the Ainu, which were very prominent in this manga. I think that it's generally a pretty respectful depiction. The author clearly really did his homework, but at the same time, there are a lot of tropes here that seem straight out of an old American Western.
Oh, absolutely. And I think calling it a Western is, a very accurate depiction, especially for people who are maybe unfamiliar with this story. I think the author is aware of this. He sometimes refers to this in interviews. He calls it a yaminabe Western, which, it's basically like a hot pot Western rather than a spaghetti Western.
That's funny. Yeah.
And so for better or worse, you can imagine how maybe if we were to be recommending to you, oh, this is a really great movie about, this grizzled Texas Ranger who teams up with this young Native American girl, maybe that would raise some eyebrows. And so, bear those caveats in mind when you hear the rest of the story.
Yeah, we should also mention that this isn't something that Golden Kamuy remembered. Hokkaido in Japanese culture has long been sort of this frontier zone in the imagination where they have their own cowboys and helpful Ainu sidekicks, all that stuff. It's a very long-running theme.
Like we talked about last episode, how the I believe we mentioned this, how the American Western Unforgiven was remade to be set in 19th century Hokkaido, with one of the characters being an Ainu guy. There is this really strong self-conception in Japan of Hokkaido as Japan's Wild West. In no small part because it was colonized at the exact same time that the American West was being colonized.
And also because American advisors were brought in for that project extensively.
Many of these same people doing American colonization would later come to Japan as employees to contribute to the colonization of Hokkaido. It's really interesting. Because of that, that's what we're saying is that Hokkaido really was seen as this kind of the frontier of the new Japan. It was where things were changing much faster than they had been changing on Honshu, the main island. Because Hokkaido was this blank slate, the transformation of Hokkaido was much more dramatic than the transformation of Honshu because there were fewer institutions that were kind of pushing against this modernization. So for that reason, many Western products like beer, like the famous brand Sapporo, named after the city in Hokkaido, that was first introduced on that island. Canned fish was a really big market. You mentioned, I believe, I don't know if you mentioned yet, but the herring trade was a really, really major part of the economy in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And there were these
And even
fish
before
canneries.
that's where the Ainus were employed in fisheries that we mentioned at the end of the last episode.
But it was after the colonization of Hokkaido that Western-style canneries were built on the island. And suddenly people from all over Japan were eating Western-style canned food coming out of Hokkaido. And so that really it was this entrepot for so many foreign ideas in a similar way to the way that Kyushu had been in 500 years earlier. And we talked about the Sengoku era when all of these European merchants and Jesuit missionaries were active in Japan. Now the northernmost island, Hokkaido, is where all these new ideas are coming into. And it really represents the complete destruction of the idea of Japan as this isolated country.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very relevant that, and I believe you all mentioned this last time, that even during the period of Japan's sort of most isolationist time, it was not isolating from its own foreign policy when it came to other people's lands that it saw as its frontier.
Yes, exactly. Okinawa and Hokkaido. Yeah, absolutely.
And as well as the Kuril Islands to a degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those being, if you're not familiar, those are the islands north of Hokkaido, now controlled by Russia, as well as also the other one we're going to mention in this episode is Sakhalin, which is also part of Russia today, which is this long island directly north of Hokkaido that also has a significant Ainu population, which we talked about last time. All right. So one last question I had before we go through the history here is the fact that historical fiction is not as common in Japan as you might expect. And, without coming off as too orientalist here, I think that there is generally some aversion in Japanese pop culture to really addressing recent history. There's so much media about the Sengoku era, but when it comes to the Meiji era and the Russo-Japanese War, I don't think these are topics that figure very prominently in Japanese media today. And I'm kind of curious to know why you think that might be, John. And if so, if that really does make Golden Kamuy unique in its approach to history, and what that might kind of say about the political view that this work of media is projecting.
I think it's interesting for a few reasons. What I'd say is that sort of this period, maybe post Meiji, but pre, height of imperial conquest, it is sometimes common as a backdrop. But then it's not necessarily viewed as like a setting for historical fiction itself. So, for example, the manga Demon Slayer, which is one of the best-selling sort of in Japanese history, is actually also set in the same time period as this story. But it's sort of pure setting, it's pure landscape because, it's people fighting demons that eat human flesh. This is like a real work of history in some sense. Many of the characters are based on real people. But for, why this aversion? I think, one is that it's probably messy. I think in general, in Japanese society, there's not always keenness to depict these things directly, partly because they're controversial. In some sense, Japan still has some, is sort of a junior partner amongst the current imperial powers, and so
absolutely.
So I think that makes it difficult, for better or worse, people who both want to address it, in a very direct way, or people who want to sort of fascistly revise history. It's just hard to talk about because it's maybe embarrassing in some sense. I think it's interesting in this case, though, because, the antagonists in this story are members of what becomes the Imperial Japanese Army.
Yes.
And I don't think that was a coincidence either. I mean, the villain of our story, who we haven't talked about yet, he's kind of a demagogue who wants to sort of create or foment a sort of fascist junior officers coup because he thinks that the centralized Japanese government sort of isn't imperial enough.
Yeah, and specifically that there's a stab in the back kind of narrative. So even though Japan won the Russo-Japanese War, he believes that these soldiers were kind of given insufficient support during the war and after by the government in Tokyo. That they were the ones out here dying on Sakhalin in the freezing cold, and then they got nothing, they got no reward. And he wants to change that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think to some degree that is one indication of the author's own views. I mean, I think he has, nothing but contempt for this sort of imperial past. But I think, also views it as like an interesting setting for, a strange and, wild story.
All right. Well, I think that's a perfect time to actually dive into the end of Tokugawa Japan, the beginning of the Meiji era, which was so inherently tied to the expansion of Japanese power for the final time into Hokkaido. Russian Sam, you've been kind of quiet. You want to lead us off with starting off with the timeline here?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just not as much of a manga enthusiast as you two are. Like, just to date myself, like the last manga I read was Death Note, so it's been a while for me.
Back in middle school?
Early high school, but yes. All right, yeah. So let's get into the stuff that I'm much more in my element with, the actual history. Let's talk about what's going on. So the Tokugawa shogunate, one of the few things that people know about this period of Japanese history is the Sagoku. That is the so-called closing off of the country to any foreign countries. Although, as we mentioned previously, and as John reminded us, this was not strictly the case. There were certain foreign domains under the Japanese rubric, which relations continue to be maintained with. And the land known as Ezochi, later Hokkaido, was one of those places. In addition to that, there were limited contacts with the Dutch, who had huge centers of power in Indonesia, as well as Taiwan up until a certain point. Meanwhile, further out west, there were European interests in Asia and the Pacific, which were gradually ramping up in the post-Napoleonic world. With the Congress of Vienna largely setting the balance of power within Europe itself, this economic control over Asia became a new avenue for competition, with the British, French, Russians, the Dutch, and eventually the Germans seeking to assert their power over Southeast Asia and attempting to force the hand of the much more powerful Chinese. The ships carrying Western merchants and missionaries would sail as far east as Hawaii, but invariably these ships attempting to reach Japan would be turned back by the shogunate, who said, no bueno, we're not dealing with you guys. We have our homies, the Dutch, and that's it.
Right, and I think it's kind of some clarification from context here. I think what's happening is that, so about 100 years into this period of isolation, European control over Asia, both Southeast Asia and parts of Northeast Asia, really, or not necessarily control, but pressure and influence really becomes much stronger. And even though Japan is isolated, the Japanese are watching this very closely. And I think if anything, across the 18th and early 19th century, they seem to think that really this isolation is the right call. Look what's happening to Vietnam and the Philippines. Even China, great and powerful China, is now falling under very significant pressures by the Western European powers by sea, as well as over land by the Russians. Because during the 17th and 18th centuries, the same period as the Japanese isolation, Russia is moving east, going honestly going kind of close to Japan. The first Russian explorers reached the Pacific Ocean in the 17th century, and then across the 18th century, Russian Cossack squadrons go around subjugating tribe after tribe of indigenous Siberian and Far Eastern peoples, eventually even including Ainu people living in modern-day Russia today, because not all of the Ainu live in Hokkaido. This has the effect of pushing the real extent of Russian control further and further east, eventually even leading to permanent colonies being established all over the Pacific coast and even in Alaska. Because as we talked about with our other friend John, Russian fur traders began to explore Alaska in the 1740s and had permanent Russian towns like Sitka in the 1780s. So that's kind of what's going on west of Japan. The Europeans, including the Russians, are really looking eastward, and Japan is not too happy about that, and for very good reason. Things are also happening in the east of Japan, because in 1805, the famous Lewis and Clark expedition reaches the Pacific Ocean, invigorating the supposed spirit of manifest destiny in the US and encouraging Washington to look as far west as possible. By the 1840s, like 35 years later, large numbers of American settlers were going to the Pacific, first into the Oregon Territory, which was shared with Britain, and then into areas like Nevada, Colorado, and California, which were being conquered from Mexico in 1848. This means that now the United States stretches from sea to shining sea, therefore is able to project its power further east. And if you're, sailing out of San Francisco or Seattle, if you're going straight east, you're gonna hit Japan. So this basically means that European interests are now approaching Japan from two different directions.
Well, I wouldn't say European interests in this context, actually, because that's actually quite the interesting thing. The early period of American history, especially throughout the 19th century, was very much focused on the Asian trade specifically, because as they saw it, they were being crowded out in Europe because obviously the British and the French had much more developed trade networks. So many entrepreneurs of the time who had a much grander vision saw that they could make their fortune out east in China and in the now closed off Japan. Mm-hmm. So by the time that the Pacific was beginning to be settled, some of these merchants were beginning to venture out of San Francisco and trying to get into Japan, which by this point had been closed off to the Anglos for 200 years nearly. Yeah. And this would never really work at this point. They would usually get fired upon by Japanese cannons until they turned back. But by the 1840s, Japan had sort of become this enigma to the Western mind. Surely great fortune and fame would fall to whichever person could pry open the gates of this unknown empire and get access to the great riches, which they're clearly hoarding behind their closed door policy. Right. So just as the British had done to China several years prior in the First Opium War, many Americans decided that they would try to make their mark in this way.
Right. One thing that you mentioned, John, before we start recording is that, interactions between Japan and China are a really interesting part of this story. Just curious, do you have any idea what the impact of the Opium War might have been in Japan at this time? Because I think it can't be a coincidence that it happened right before the Meiji Restoration.
Oh, not at all. I mean, I would say that amongst the Japanese elite, it was viewed as a almost like existential threat, and in some sense, sort of during the Opium Wars, one of the one of the decisive elements that really led to the kind of British domination was specifically the metal gunboats they were using against these Chinese junks. The Brits would often get just, sort of roundly defeated in land wars amongst these conflicts, but they just had this naval superiority. And then again, with, I think as we're about to get to, with the arrival of, Commodore Perry's black ships, this was that nightmare sort of becoming real from the point of view of the Japanese elites.
Yeah. Right. So let's talk about how that nightmare first came to befall Japan, that being the barbarian foreigners coming into the ports of Japan. I think interestingly is that, in a way, the US was about as far geographically from Japan as England is. Probably 2,000, 3,000 miles? It might be farther. I don't know I'm not sure if the Pacific Ocean is larger than Eurasia. But in a way, it's actually much more accessible because it's a lot easier to cross an ocean than to cross a continent. So that means that there was a lot of constant but low-level contact between American and Japanese sailors. encounters, often caused by Japanese or American sailors being shipwrecked and being picked up by each other's ships, especially in like the islands of the South Pacific, or even in a few cases of Japanese sailors drifting all the way to the US or Japan. In at least one case, actually, one Japanese person was even adopted into a local Native American tribe that brought him in, which is kind of interesting. Probably the most famous case of these Japanese castaways was in 1845 when an American whaling ship called the Manhattan picked up some people and decided to bring them back to Japan, to Tokyo. They managed to get as far as the harbor of Tokyo, but weren't allowed to enter. And as soon as they got there, their ship was boarded by a Japanese nobleman, a samurai named Moriyama Inosuke, who's a really interesting figure. He was a member of what they called the Dutch learning. Can you describe this a little bit, Sam?
Yeah, although Japan had closed its border to most foreign contact, nevertheless, they were very interested in learning what the West had to offer, really. The Jesuits had really tantalizing bits of information there that the Japanese, even those who wanted nothing to do with Christianity, recognized as something that would be of great benefit to master. So to that end, because the Dutch were allowed to trade in Nagasaki with the Japanese, they would often bring books with them. And as the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries dragged on, there were these different scholarly traditions emerging within Japan. You had the so-called kokugaku, the national studies. Mm-hmm. This was the stuff, this was the Japanese literature. This was all the philology that they were doing and attempting to reconstruct their history, as well as to reform themselves to be in a more purely Japanese mold, which would prefigure a lot of the darker elements of Japanese history in the 20th century. But in addition to that, you had so-called rangoku, the foreign studies. So to that end, you had some people who would specialize in learning Dutch and sifting through all of these medical books, geography books, etc. So even though Japan was closed off for the most part, it wasn't really hermetically sealed. They were still getting some the knowledge that was coming out of Europe, especially practical stuff like medicine. Yeah,
you're right. And what this meant was that there was a class of Japanese people, mostly samurai, who had a little bit more knowledge of the West than others. And these are the people who the government, the shogunate, would turn to when they had these sporadic encounters with foreigners. And so then the most dramatic of these before the Perry expedition was when Moriyama Inosuke received these refugees, essentially, these shipwrecked sailors who had been taken on by the ship, the Manhattan. He was the only person in all of Japan who spoke any English because he had been taught some English by these Dutch merchants, but it was very little. And apparently he seems to have realized as soon as he got on the ship that whatever he was taught by the Dutch wasn't actually that helpful. He was able to make some contact with the Americans, and we know that he was very interested in the ethnic diversity of the American crew because a lot of paintings made based on his testimony show that the American sailors included African Americans and even Native Americans on the crew, which is interesting. So anyways, he welcomes back the survivors, returns to the shogun, who then decides that it's great that these guys were dropped off back in Tokyo, but we don't want this to happen again. Just because the very presence of this American ship in our harbor is too much of a threat, especially once they noticed the amount of guns on the ship, which seemed to be much more sophisticated than Japanese cannons at this time. So Moriyama goes back to the Manhattan and tells them, "Thank you so much for dropping off our refugees. Here are some gifts of Japanese sweet potatoes and green tea. And now please go back to America and never, ever return, even to drop off castaways." And so it seems like that on the eve of the Perry expedition, it seems like this isolation policy was ironclad. But this kind of contact with the Manhattan only led the Americans to really redouble their resolve to open up Japan, essentially, basically expanding American imperial power to Japan. And again, after what had happened to China just several years before, Japan really didn't want this. Before we get into the Perry expedition itself, we do have to mention it's a great story. There was one American citizen who managed to reach Japan between the Manhattan incident and the Perry expedition. And his name was, I'm not kidding, Ronald McDonald.
Do you think he was loving it?
Hope so. Thankfully, he spells Ronald the Scottish way with an A, not an O, because his father was a Scottish fur trader active in both the US and Canada in the jointly shared Oregon Territory. His mother, interestingly, was a member of the Chinook Native American nation. And it really seems like he was very much on the side of the colonizers here politically. He was a bank teller in a colony. He lived in white American society, but he didn't love it. And so when he was 21, he became a whaler, like so many wayward young men, sailing around Japan, but he found out that like just seeing Japan from afar on these whaling trips wasn't enough. He was really taken in with the mystique of this closed off country. So when he was 24, he made the absolutely insane decision to grab a dinghy and escape this whaling ship on his own and sail off to Japan without speaking a word of Japanese.
I mean, this is among the most committed of any sort of Orientalist white boys there have ever been.
Oh yeah, I know this guy. He is the original weeb. It's crazy, and he survived. But the funniest part is that because he had no knowledge of the geography of Japan, he didn't realize that the part of Japan he was landing on, I want to say in like 1849, was in fact Hokkaido, which was not yet formerly part of the Japanese nation. He was taken in by a group of Ainu tribespeople, the local indigenous inhabitants, who then turned him over to the closest Japanese authority of the Matsume clan. I'm saying that totally wrong, right? How do I say that? I'm so sorry, John. I know you know how to pronounce it.
It's Matsumae.
Thank you. And so the local Matsumae daimyo, then when he found this strange, American half-white guy in Japan, knew that this was a huge security concern for the country. So they decided, pretty insanely, to send him packing all the way to Nagasaki, which was the kind of where the Dutch were allowed. It was the only foreign port in the country. So he was taken on this, must have been a grueling journey all the way from Hokkaido in the northeast to Nagasaki in the far southwest. He survived this journey, and there he met with one of those Japanese samurai involved in the so-called Dutch learning. And it was that guy we just saw, Moriyama Inosuke. So here, Moriyama was very interested to finally meet a native English speaker because, previously Moriyama had been training with these Dutch merchants who barely spoke English themselves. Here is an actual English-speaking American. And so for 6 months, Ronald McDonald lived in a Buddhist temple where he gave private Japanese lessons.
English.
Moriyama Inosuke. English, thank you, English lessons. And then eventually another American whaling ship would pass by Japan, be flagged, and Ronald McDonald would be sent packing. He would never return to Japan, from what I understand, but he would go to America and he would actually write an address to Congress, basically debriefing what he saw of the Japanese nation. Because besides some Dutch merchants, nobody from the West had been to Japan in 200 years, at least as far as anyone knew. And this testimony really sparked the U.S. interest in Japan. And although Ronald McDonald seems to have been very respectful of Japanese traditions, he really enjoyed his time there. Other Americans were a little more heavy-handed in their dealings. Probably the most important of these was Commodore Matthew Perry, who was not the guy from Friends. Right. So what do you know about Matthew Perry and the Perry expedition, John?
I mean, he's one of the most sort of famous figures in this period of Japanese history. I think, maybe even people that have only sort of done a casual perusal of it have likely encountered him. There's a very sort of viral YouTube video from a few years ago. I think it's like the history of Japan or something.
Oh, yes.
Cutesy. Yeah. So Sam's seen it. In particular, there's sort of the prehistory, and then there's a period maybe halfway through the video where the cheery audio cuts out and this, just imposing sort of, image of Perry is suddenly superimposed onto the screen. And I'm sure that's probably what his, black ships looked like.
Yeah, just this sudden arrival. And I think it really, the image of Perry that you get, which I think is from both in Japanese media and I think also, which is pretty accurate, is he really was the ultimate kind of boorish, ugly American, this very bombastic, aggressive guy.
Absolutely.
Who spearheaded this opening up. Like so many other members of the military brass of America at this time, he was from a Scots-Irish family. He was very important in the War of 1812, actually, because he helped start it. He led an unauthorized attack on the British Navy in like 1811 or something, because as some of you guys might remember from high school, British troops were doing impressment of American sailors.
Right.
He attacks a British vessel, later on has a storied career all across. He was one of the most prominent American Navy officers. First, he fought in the Barbary Wars we talked about before, not long after this, in 1819, I want to say, in the Second Barbary War. He had a lot of activities in Africa for some reason. I didn't realize this because he was involved in the early kind of Liberia colonization scheme. So he would patrol those waters on behalf of the Liberian government. He was really instrumental in the annexation of Key West, which was actually a Spanish colony colony until the 1820s, long after the rest of Florida. And he would even be active in the Mexican-American War. So he really was the go-to guy for international, basically gunboat diplomacy for the United States. And he also was one of the foremost experts in the brand new steam navy in the 1850s. Because until the 1850s, America had been using entirely, classic sailing ships. But now, the times were changing. America has developed a brand new navy. And so in 1853, he goes to Japan in his first of 2 attempts to open up the famous ports of Japan, the closed-off kingdom, to the West. Do you know anything about the kind of the play-by-play here? I don't know a few details about the encounter.
I think this is maybe the part I'm most familiar with. But
please,
so
yeah.
It's actually sort of alarming, some of the details. So in particular, the first arrival, 1853, the initial demands are presented, and then he sails back to the U.S. 6 months later, he returns March 1854, and he says, more or less, I'm ready for you to sign now. There are 9 ironclad gunboats, a crew of roughly 1,800 people. And he says, basically, I'm ready to bombard what is now Tokyo and slaughter the whole population of 1 million if you're not going to agree to the terms presented last time. And these cannons were mounted and aimed throughout the signing. Like he didn't even sort of bring the boats in. And he claimed at the time that this was to sort of command fear and astound the Orientals. He was determined and prepared to prevent their well-known duplicity, was his quote at the time.
Oof.
Now the real kicker, if you thought that was racist, he dials it up even more. After the signing, he celebrates with what is Japan's first recorded minstrel show in its history.
Yes, it's insane. It's everything terrible about America. No, I know. So actually, here's a quote here that Sam found. 3 weeks of negotiation ensued, accompanied by diplomatic gestures such as the exchange of state gifts. The Americans presented the Japanese with a miniature steam train, a telegraph apparatus, agricultural tools, and small arms, as well as 100 gallons of whiskey and some books about the United States. The Japanese responded with gold lacquered furniture, bronze ornaments, silk garments, and, upon learning of Perry's personal hobby, a collection of seashells. Cultural displays were also performed on both sides, with the American sailors performing a blackface minstrel show, while a number of high-ranking sumo wrestlers performed feats of strength for American audiences.
Yeah, I was just telling Liam, there needs to be a movie made pronto about the opening of Japan from the perspective of the minstrel actors aboard the Perry expedition.
Maybe so.
So the other interesting thing, there are no Japanese language materials known describing this event. There's lots of English language documentation.
Paintings.
Yeah. They're paintings.
Just like how there are paintings of the Manhattan incident.
Exactly. But there's sort of no writings describing the event, whereas there's quite a few pamphlets that the American side produced. The real sort of kicker also is that the minstrel troupe, they're referred to as the Japanese minstrels, like as if these were not, performers that were brought by the Americans, but it's like, you also have this long, rich tradition of racism against black people, just like us. So basically, this was incredibly psychologically demoralizing, especially in the context of what had happened to China just 10 years prior. This incredibly brutal, forcible opening up of Japan by the Americans, totally on American terms, which would basically eventually lead to the infamous kind of unequal trade treaties that were signed by the Americans and would then be followed by other countries. And so there was a lot of internal turmoil about this in response to the shogunate acceding to the demands of these boorish Americans, represented by the ultimate boor, Matthew Perry. And then in 1854, as if answering this, cause of events, in December of that year, huge earthquakes shock Japan, killing tens of thousands of people. And many Japanese people, both high and low in society, are convinced these earthquakes aren't just geological, these are cosmological. The Shinto gods are not happy with what we're doing. We've got to change course.
Right. So at this point, the American diplomats began to negotiate all these unfavorable trade treaties, and the Europeans, seeing what the Americans had done, weren't far behind, also getting in on the action. The Japanese, of course, had no way of resisting any of this.
Yeah, again, because they were threatened with the murder of 1 million people. It's horrifying.
Yeah, they just had no way of fighting back. And I mean, I really suspect that that's part of why there is so little contemporary Japanese record of this, because it was just a very deeply traumatizing event, and it's not really something you want to draw attention to when you're in such a powerless position. At least that's the way I understand it.
Totally. I think it's fair to say, John, this is kind of a miniature version in the Japanese cultural memory of the infamous Chinese century of humiliation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think this is partly why during the ensuing period of modernization, there was sort of such a desperate attempt to see, okay, we saw what things looked like for China. We've already been put in this situation of becoming, sort of extraterritoriality. How can we become like these people colonizing us rather than the colonized? Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, like I said, it's going to eventually become a case of if you can't beat them, join them. Because right now, it seems like Japan has no way of beating them, especially with the principle of extraterritoriality, which basically means that Western merchants can just run rampant doing whatever they want in Japan, being as criminal as they'd like, because the Japanese government has no accountability over them. Also in this time, you're talking about, what was happening in China. We got to mention 1858. This is the start of the Taiping Rebellion that we've alluded to in the past before. Really interesting topic. Eventually, we're gonna have to do a whole episode on it. This was, when there was this vaguely Christian revolution in China that led to this massive civil war. Bringing this up because due to this chaos, foreign powers, especially Russia and also Britain, start to really ramp up their economic pressure on China, and Russia goes so far as to fighting a land war with China, where they invade Manchuria in the northeast. This is the homeland of the Qing ruling class, take over basically all of Manchuria, or at least most of it, and established in the process the modern Russo-Chinese border that still exists today. This really brings, we mentioned how islands like Sakhalin, these really become much more strongly under Russian control over this after this point, after 1858, especially because in 1860, the Russians build their great port of Vladivostok on the Sea of Japan. This was supposed to be Russia's great entry into the Pacific world, until it was discovered that actually someone did the math wrong, and Vladivostok was actually so far north that it freezes in the winter. So therefore, it is only a cold water port, not a warm water port. That phrase, warm water port, still comes up in discussions about Russian geopolitics even today, especially in the Russo-Ukraine war right now. But anyways, at this point, the person realizing that their land might be the subject of a Russian incursion to take a warm water port was not Ukraine, but Japan. Because unlike the ports of Vladivostok, the ports of Hokkaido and Honshu were warm water ports that could be accessible year round. And that's why it's something I never knew about until I was researching this episode. John, do you know about the Tsushima incident? It's crazy.
I don't know much about it. I mean, you were the one who had mentioned it to me when we were first learning about it. So, or, discussing. So feel free to, maybe background it, because it was also a shock to me.
Yeah, well, basically, so that just a year after building Vladivostok and realizing that, damn it, we actually can't use this port in the winter, Russia immediately invades part of Japan. They attempted to conquer the Japanese island of Tsushima that you've otherwise maybe heard of because it was briefly a Mongol colony in the 13th century.
And also because it was the site of the much more famous Battle of 1905. But in 1861, there's kind of a prelude to that battle between the Russians and the Japanese, when the Russian Navy just docks on this island and immediately kills a local Japanese peasant. Japanese officials out of Edo demanded that the Russians leave. And when the Russians said, no, absolutely not, this is our island now, Japan actually turned to the British for assistance because they knew that the Russians and the British did not get along. And, although the
the Russians had their cold water port in Vladivostok. The British at this time had many relatively nearby warm water ports, probably most importantly, Singapore, but also, the ports of in India and Australia. So the British Navy had a very active presence in the Pacific, meaning that even though England was so far away from Japan, the British Empire could be a potential counterweight toward Russia.
Maybe I should mention, just because this does tie back to some of the other things we discussed, Tsushima maybe was historically also viewed very much as part of this Japanese frontier for its own borders. And so, maybe around the 15th century or so was the site of a lot of conflict at the time. I think in some sense, this also prefigured the fight over Sakhalin between Russia and Japan. Maybe I'll just mention that briefly.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Well, in any case, squadrons of British ships coming up from Singapore, as well as the much newer British colony of Hong Kong, come up to confront the Russians. There really is actually a genuine threat of war between Russia and Britain over the tiny island of Tsushima and its implications on Japanese sovereignty. Eventually, Russia, not wanting a war with Britain, especially because this is very shortly after the Crimean War, which ended not very well for Russia, they back down. They renounce any attempt to take this island, but they do not renounce their attempts to move into other parts of Japan. Specifically, there is a great Russian interest in the island of Hokkaido, just across from the Russian-controlled island of Sakhalin. And this really freaks out the Japanese public. We should mention that Japan was a very literate country. It had a high literacy rate, much higher than Western countries did, across the Tokugawa era, which I don't really know why that is, which is an interesting little kind of quirk of their history. This means that many people, rich and poor, are reading newspaper accounts about what these European powers are doing. And that there comes to be widespread political resentment of the Tokugawa government, just like you start to see resentment in China toward the Qing Empire, leading to stuff like the Taiping Rebellion. People at all levels of Japanese society start to think that the Tokugawa shogunate is not able to properly stand up to these foreigners. A new government should come in. And what really makes this political and economic transition in Japan so interesting and unique, which we alluded to, is that this pressure, this upswell of dissent against the government does not look kind of forward for its, the liberation of Japan, but instead in a weird way looks backward.
Yeah, they were really leaning into the Kokugaku stuff that I was talking about previously in juxtaposition with the Dutch studies. But anyway, this really culminated very publicly. A lot of anti-Western ronin, that is masterless samurai, began carrying out public assassination campaigns of Tokugawa officials as well as foreign dignitaries. Yeah. So the consensus seemed to show that this sporadic violence is not enough to thwart the foreigners. So to restore the dignity of Japan, it was thought that the weak shogun must be overthrown and the figurehead emperor should be restored to power.
And that's when I said, when I was saying backwards looking, that's what I mean. There was this belief that a re-entrenchment of royal, essentially feudal authority could protect Japan from the really genuinely terrifying onslaught of the Americans.
Yeah, and
which really felt like an existential threat to Japan at this point.
Yeah, and just a reminder, the emperor had been a figurehead in Japanese history all the way back to the end of the 12th century. So it had really been a while since the emperor had actual sovereignty over this country that he supposedly headed. But anyway, the shogun must be overthrown, the emperor must be restored to power, and two groups would emerge within Japan with slightly different views of how to do this. There was a Kobugatai who wanted the shogun and the emperor to have co-equal status. And then there was the Sonojoi movement, that is revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, who wanted to restore Japan to the imagined early medieval past when the emperor had complete control. This name Sonojoi, it was borrowed from an ancient Chinese phrase, which was recorded by Confucius. And so that just goes to show how deeply Chinese culture was still embedded in Japan, even as they were moving towards a more national mode.
That kind of reminds me of, just before we get too ahead of ourselves here, are you familiar, John, with the Japanese phrase, the analects and the abacus?
No, I've not heard this phrase.
Well, so this was, I can't remember his name, but there was some big industrialist in the era we're talking about here, I think kind of the middle Meiji era in the 1870s, who basically said that, this was the ethos of Japan looking backwards and forwards at the same time, which kind of would become I think it's fair to say, is the ethos of the Meiji Restoration, was the idea that they should double down on their commitment to traditional Japanese values, which really meant, oftentimes basically Chinese culture. The high literary culture of figures like Confucius, whose famous book was called The Analects of Confucius. But at the same time, also honing their skills on the abacus, like, that being modern understandings of mathematics, science, and all that. And that's basically what would happen in Japan going forward as a result of these two movements, Kobu Gatai and Sono Joi. And really the idea was that if they restore the emperor, they can help Japan restore its former glory in effect. But the most important thing would be to kick out all these dastardly Americans. Another thing...
I think culturally, this is also a period of sort of a real sort of national identity being created. So, it seems to a large degree that you were saying before about, many of these ancient traditions also having kind of roots in Chinese interaction. But it seems like this was a real period of trying to assert, okay, these are the Japanese national characters. Maybe that's sort of what's always occurring when you have some, budding bourgeois revolution.
Yeah, and that's the thing here is that the revolution that's about to happen, it really is fundamentally a bourgeois revolution wearing this feudal mask. Which I thought, right? I think you think it's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of mixing, I think, is reflected in a lot of the, a lot of the culture of the time, where you had people with kind of Western style hairstyles, but mixing it with like more traditional patterns of dress. So you'd have someone with mutton chops and then also wearing like a yukata or something.
There's a lot of mutton chops in this era, a lot of beards. It's Japan really latched onto the Victorian obsession with facial hair at this time. And this kind of transformation of Japan actually begins slightly before the Meiji Restoration, because in the last years of the Tokugawa era, lots of Japanese diplomats start going abroad, initially as diplomats, and then eventually even later as students attending American universities. In 1860, there was the first of these big foreign diplomatic missions since the 18th century, when different groups of Japanese diplomats go to the US, to London, and to Paris. And it seems like those going to all of these places did not have a great time. Although the American groups were given an audience with the President James Buchanan in DC, they were really miffed at being told that they had to stay in Chinese hotels wherever they went. They really didn't like being lumped in with the Chinese and being the victims of American racial hierarchies. And then when they visited London and Paris, they were not given this at the red carpet they expected. And instead, these diplomats were just basically told that their real job had to be to go back to Japan and tell the shogun to be even more accommodating to these foreign merchants.
Yeah, so that must have bred a lot of feelings of resentment. But nevertheless, it didn't really put a pedal on the Japanese desire to reach out to the world and to imbibe this European ethos.
No, but what it might have done is kind of inspire the Japanese elite to strike back violently, literally, against these Western incursions.
Yeah. So in 1862, a 28-year-old merchant named Charles Lennox Richardson, who was based in Shanghai, visited Japan on a sightseeing tour before planning to return home to London. While he was riding his horse near the city of Yokohama, him and his friends had the terrible luck of crossing the path of a procession of Shimazu Hisamitsu, one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan and also a major player in the anti-foreign Kobugatai movement that we mentioned above. Now, Shimazu's samurai demanded that Richardson step aside as he was dealing with the daimyo, and this man was clearly a common-born foreigner. When Richardson refused, Shimazu invoked an ancient feudal privilege called the kirisute gomen, the right of the nobleman to kill any commoner who disrespects him. Shimazu ordered his samurai to run Richardson through with their swords. His friends managed to escape and inform the British consulate, but Richardson was dead.
Yeah, and this was a huge international crisis, and to make matters worse from the perspective of the British, there was this great kind of rallying around the flag effect in Japan. The Japanese public really celebrated the murder of this guy because they saw this as finally Japan striking back against these foreigners. All these woodcuts were made about this heroic samurai killing this haughty foreigner. But this would have huge ramifications in Japan. The emperor at this time, the father of the Meiji emperor, would actually declare his support in the wake of this scandal for the expel the foreigners movement. He demanded in the wake of this killing that all Americans and Europeans leave Japan within 2 months. The shogun, though, had the real power in Japan at this time. The emperor really could not order laws himself. So this was really just a kind of spiritual gesture, but it really showed to the Europeans that things were not going the way they wanted to, especially when rogue daimyo sea lords began attacking American and British ships as pirates, just as their ancestors had done 300 years prior. Mm-hmm. We should mention here that one of the ships that was actually attacked at this time was the USS Wyoming, which some of our listeners might have heard of because it was being attacked by Japan at the same time that it was actually chasing a Confederate ship called the Alabama across the Pacific because the American Civil War had just broken out.
Wow, that's neat. And going off on a little bit of a tangent here, I must say, we mentioned that this period was sort of the Japanese equivalent of the Century of Humiliation. This really strongly echoes, at least to me, the Boxer Rebellion moment, except this one was far less bloody, I would say. But nevertheless, you just see these same kinds of rhyming dynamics in history.
Right. And also, I think an important thing here is that apparently Japanese writers at the time noted that this guy Richardson, who was killed, had been previously active in China, and that according to these Japanese writers, he expected a level of deference from Asian people that he got in China, but that the Japanese would refuse to give him. And so this was basically Japan not only standing up to the Europeans, but also in a weird way separating themselves from this supposed compliance in China. And in the process, really, like you said, John, establishing the Japanese national identity. And I think in a way, the whole abacus and analects thing was also kind of showing that Japan can do Chinese civilization better than China can, which would have very dire ramifications in the later conflicts with China.
One thing I wanted to touch on maybe, and it sort of relates to a lot of these growing conflicts as the maybe civil war is simmering. This common thread we've mentioned between a lot of them is these various humiliations being inflicted by Europeans. But there's a very specific geographic character to them as well, which is they're typically ensued in part by some local noble or daimyo permitting violence against Europeans, which then provokes some response, whether it's this Richardson affair. And one thing that's interesting is that they're all geographically contained to sort of the southwest of the island, which we had mentioned earlier were these sort of both peripheral provinces amongst the shogunate, but also absolutely pivotal in winning the Civil War. So
right. Yes, that's so important. And it's because even before the Civil War breaks out of the Meiji Restoration, you see how, these southwestern lords are the ones who are already essentially defying the will of the shogun, who in their view wants Japan to go the way of China.
Precisely. And so with the Richardson affair in the sort of Satsuma region, or another sort of there's an entire campaign against Shimonoseki in Choshu, which was it was an alliance of like the Great Britain, France, and I think the Dutch that was just bombarding this port city for almost a year and a half. But was similarly provoked by some violence against one sort of upstart foreigner like Richardson.
Right. And just like that, you see here with the bombardment of Kagoshima, which the British Empire commits against Japan. And really this bombardment, it wasn't, although as far as I understand, it was not particularly deadly. You see the British kind of following up on the threats that the Americans made, where they just start firing their cannons toward the city of Kagoshima after Japan refuses to hand over the various samurai who killed Richardson. Interestingly, actually, although this had very dire ramifications for Japan, there actually were higher casualties on the British side because the old-fashioned Japanese cannons managed to successfully sink a British ship and kill 2 of the leading naval officers leading the invasion, which is kind of interesting. But then, not long after, the very next year, as a result of all these boiling tensions in Japan, Japan gets its own civil war that you're mentioning, just the exact same time as the American Civil War.
Right. So in 1864, Japan collapses into one of its own civil wars of this period, especially in the area around Mito, which is near modern-day Tokyo. What happened was around 2,000 insurgents took up arms to restore the emperor and overthrow the shogun, as well as to, of course, expel the foreigners. Although the shogun's forces would quell this rebellion and kill hundreds of suspected collaborators in reprisals that would follow, they would suffer significantly more losses than the rebels. And now would be a good time to mention another dynamic through all of this. This was a period of the shogunate when they were particularly unlucky because just as all of this is happening, you have a line of very sickly shoguns coming to the fore of the Tokugawa at a time when there needed to be a stronger leader. So around this time, the adult shogun dies and passes it on to his son, who's still a teenager at that point, I believe, who is also sickly. And just these are not the sorts of people who can match the responsibility that's being flung before them, which makes this anti-shogunal mood, I would say, all the more pressing.
But I think the thing also to stress here is that even though, the shogunate was believed to not be able to properly resist the foreigners, just like the Qing government of China, they did make a very serious effort to confront this threat. And just like the Qing, they had their own kind of abortive modernization attempts. So I think, for example, in I think it was 1867, the shogun at the time decided that to earn the respect of the Europeans, Japanese diplomats should wear European clothing when dealing with foreigners, which they would basically do until today. Japanese people wear Western suits, and this is a result due to this change. Interestingly, part of this was because the shogun's younger brother visited the Paris World's Fair in that year. And he was so impressed with European fashion that he ordered a huge bulk shipment of suits. He also brought back a small group of French military advisors who began to reorganize the Japanese military on European lines. This reorganization would have really huge implications for Japanese history as Japan began to develop a modern European-style military. But, kind of spoiler alert here, it wouldn't be the shogun who would be using this military. What really sets things going is in 1867, the emperor at the time, Emperor Komei, dies at age 36. He is replaced by his 14-year-old son, the new Emperor Meiji. You got any thoughts on this guy, John?
I mean, what can I say about this 14-year-old princeling? I mean,
what he would represent.
I mean, I think he would, be a very useful figurehead for the sort of successful winners of the Civil War. Because who better to put on, all your nationalist ambitions than someone who's just going to goo goo gaga kind of sign off on them?
Right. And do you have any thoughts, before we kind of get to this, so do you have any thoughts on this Civil War that would eventually put, at least nominally, Emperor Meiji in the full driver's seat and overthrow the shogun?
One thing that I think is, maybe sort of burbling at the surface is there seemed to be like this kind of long-running breakdown of the sort of feudal authority amongst the shogunate, whether it's between these peripheral provinces or in general this inability to respond to the threats and the ensuing instability that it had caused.
Yeah.
But it's sort of interesting because it's not really clear to me what could have happened in this kind of historical what if the sides had reversed. So I think this is something you're going to say later, but the Sano Joy movement, they fail in some sense, or, they fail to live up to their ideals.
Yes, because whether or not the emperor is restored is a matter of some debate. I think it really seems like he's a figurehead being shuffled from one group of noblemen and merchants to another, right?
Yeah, and the foreigners are far from being expelled.
Yeah, so and that's what we're going to end with. Yeah.
So this feels like a civil war where it's sort of like, it's not clear to me what would have happened in a what if scenario where they had, they hadn't failed.
Right. By 1868 though, the shogun had been basically evicted from Edo. A group of noblemen, including a guy named Iwakura Tomomi, who's going to be very important, led this coup. There were a few attempted counter coups, but it seemed like by 1869, this new ruling class, largely led by people from the southwest of Honshu, not the northeast, as had previously been the power, people not from Edo, they really began to establish a new order for Japanese society, and there was quickly a lot of internal debate about what kind of direction this new society should take. Everyone agreed they had to restore the emperor and get rid of the foreigners, but there was a general interest in bringing in some kinds of new foreign ideas to meet the foreigners.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the aspects that I feel it's absolutely essential to touch on, which we haven't spoken about yet, is the political economic basis of this Boshin War, as it was called. This was sort of a war between the samurai of the shogunate and people who wanted to fundamentally remake Japan, as John has been mentioning constantly. And one of these changes meant that they wanted to rid the samurai of their traditional feudal privileges, where these guys would be free to practice swordsmanship and whatnot with their days while they're collecting tribute and rice.
Yeah, including killing English merchants.
Yeah, while getting paid in English rice from their tenant farmers who are in a really lowly position where, I guess they could just be killed for disrespecting a nobleman, as this Englishman was unfortunate enough to find out. And so consequently, this was a deeply unproductive mode of production. And even though it was not great for the country, it was good for individuals in that these people didn't really have any other skills. They couldn't put themselves to use in any other way, really. And so this wasn't really a war between samurai and non-samurai as much as it was a war between the samurai who wanted to reform the system and unleash Japan and the samurai who wanted to maintain their traditional feudal privileges.
Well, and I think, coming back to your point, Sam, I think this is a really good way to view it as sort of samurai reformers versus samurai extremists, because in particular, many of the various sub-factions are almost entirely composed of these, these ronin, as you had said, these sort of, this warrior caste, which, didn't have formal rulers. It's sort of surprising to me that this war was as unbloody as it was, because basically many of the combatants were some analog of mercenaries almost,
Well, yeah, but they'd also not been at war for almost 200 years at that point, so it was all for show, really. A lot of what we know about Bushido as the samurai code, that was basically just guys LARPing about things that their great grandfathers did from the comfort of their futons while remaining idle.
Much like the present day.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. All right. Well, so Sam, let's talk about what these guys, these kind of disgruntled ronin who were being forced out of the halls of power, what they would do, specifically on the island of Hokkaido, really bringing this back to Golden Kamuy.
Right. Of course. So for this section, we're going to rewind a little bit. Because I just want to set the stage for what's going on in this period. We're at a point where Hokkaido is still called Ezo. We left off on the Ainu episode in the aftermath of Shakushane's rebellion, where the Ainu were reduced to a condition of dependence and entangled in the Japanese market system. They could no longer survive without trading their raw commodities for rice, because there were too many of them, and market pressures were too great for all of these goods to go into Japan for them to feed themselves otherwise. Others would become employed in Japanese fisheries, which with time gave them fewer and fewer goods for their catch. This was the northern 2/3 of the island, which was still which was outside of any kind of Japanese purview, really formally at least. Meanwhile, on the southern Oshima Peninsula and the surrounding areas, you had the domain of the Matsumae family. This territory was the Wajinshi, that is, the Japanese lands, while the former area in the north were the Ezochi, the Ezo lands. Neither land was formally Japanese territory, but the Japanese court long felt that there were special interests that had to be defended on the island. So this would continue to be the state of affairs until the second half of the 18th century, when fears of Russian encroachment really began to spring up much more noticeably. Now, this became a problem in the late 18th century when one shogun official named Tenuma... When one shogun official named Tenuma Okitsugu was dispatched to Ezo in the 1780s after a report had reached the island that the Matsumae were allowing Russian merchants to trade on the island.
And just to jump in here, Russia really was seen as the primary threat here. Even though Russia had not yet at this point actually bombarded Japan like the British had done, it was the enemy at home, essentially, because Sakhalin is just right across the straits from Hokkaido.
Right. So Tanuma, he goes to Ezo and he finds evidence, including crosses left over the place, that there were indeed Russian merchants hanging out and so close to their frontiers. And this led to a lot of fear from Japanese officials because, again, Ezo had sort of occupied the Japanese imaginary for hundreds of years at this point as like a place where Japan could be invaded from, especially in the aftermath of the Qing takeover of China. And so,
and we mentioned a while back, there was even some fear that Hokkaido in the 12th century or 13th century could be a Mongol launch pad for an invasion.
Yes, exactly. So in the context of all this, Tenuma prefigured what would be done nearly a century later. He proposed that socially undesirable elements like the impoverished commoners and the eta, the Japanese untouchable caste, basically, be brought in to settle and develop the island. Tenuma would be forced from power shortly after this proposal, so nothing came of it, but the idea was clearly out there. So, despite the refusal to implement Tenuma's proposal, however, the shogunate began to look upon Ezo with a much closer eye. The Matsumae were now under suspicion, and from 1799, the shogun would establish the Hakodate Bugyo to control eastern Ezo directly. Then, in 1807, after a scorned Russian ambassador who had attempted to open diplomatic relations was rebuffed by Tokugawa officials, he began to plunder Sakhalin and Ezo, and so the shogunate took direct control of the island under the pretext of a state of emergency, which would continue until 1821. At this point, the Matsumae would regain control, but further clashes with Russia in 1854 would resume the previous state of affairs, and the Matsumae would never again regain control of their traditional domains.
Before we go, we talked a lot about the Matsumae before here. Any closing thoughts on these guys, John? We mentioned them last episode, you mentioned them this episode.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think they're also very interesting, right? Because they were basically like, how can I put this? If Hokkaido was like this sort of frontier in the Japanese imaginary, they were a bit like colonial overseers.
Yeah, 100%.
Yes.
And again, just because to reiterate this,
they're like the Ezo viceroy.
Totally, because Hokkaido, then called Ezo, was not part of Japan really, but despite that, Japanese settlers were very active. In our episode on American frontier pirates, we mentioned how a lot of American settlers were colonizing America before the U.S. had legally taken control over a lot of territories. This is very similar, but except instead of lasting several decades, this process lasts for 200 years, where with the terrible consequences on the Ainu. Basically what happens here is that Japanese settlers, mostly under the Matsumai domain, they are essentially protected by Japanese law in a place where Japanese law does not apply. Therefore, they cannot be held accountable by the Japanese government for committing atrocities against the local Ainu. The local Ainu, meanwhile, are the victims of Japanese imperial power, but are not protected by Japanese law. It's this terrible middle ground where Hokkaido is essentially not a country, and therefore it is able to suffer this really heinous military occupation, essentially, due to this gray area colonial status.
Well, I think it's also interesting because in some sense, I think the Matsumai domain, it's sort of, even though it was established so early on, right, like in the 16th century roughly, I think it really prefigures the modernization period because unlike the sort of other feudal domains, which are relying on these tenant farmers and this sort of warrior caste, it's entirely dependent on trade and, sort of generates profit in that way.
And commodity production.
Yeah, precisely. So it's both like a site of primitive accumulation. You have these, sort of these people that you can, bring into your ambit, but you can also trade with neighboring countries. You can use the fact that it's such a sort of resource-rich part of what is now the country that you're taking it over. So I mean, in some sense, I think like Hokkaido was both, the model Japan used for itself when it fully enters its imperial period.
Right. In case our listeners are a little bit lost here, just to ground this, what's going on here is that this island, which had long been at the periphery of Japanese society, is now under the direct control of the shogunate, of the Japanese government. It is not yet, however, formally part of Japan. That's going to come later. But it means that Hokkaido is now much more important to Japanese society, and the elites of Japanese society understand that Hokkaido is a place where if things get tough, they can essentially hide out. This has already been an hour and a half. We should kind of get to the end here. But Russian Sam, let's talk about the way that after the annexation, after the shogunate took control of Hokkaido but did not yet incorporate it into Japan, it became increasingly important to Japanese politics.
Right. So, well, first of all, because of the Russian threat, the shogunate became much more interested in the Ainu question, and they began to explore avenues to bring the Ainu into the fold as Japanese subjects, and even to assimilate these barbarians into Japanese cultures and ways of life, even after over a century of policy which had prevented the Ainu from learning agriculture or even to speak Japanese, really. So this discourse and thoughts of settlement of Ezo showed that while Meiji was adapting Western terminology and technologies for these ends, the ideas themselves had already been explored independent of Western influence. So Japan was already on this trajectory, regardless of the encounters with the Americans. But continuing on, before Meiji could undertake the colonization of Hokkaido themselves, there would be a brief interlude from another force. This was the so-called Republic of Ezo, which, it should be noted, was not Republican in the slightest. It was really a brilliant bit of PR flourish in the hopes of attracting Western support, but it would come to naught. So let's get into that. The Meiji Restoration was made possible by the Boshin War, as we mentioned. And so, again, you had this contest between the more traditionalist samurai faction and those who wanted to modernize Japan extensively, both socially and technologically. And part of that package included the restoration of the emperor, who had been a figurehead, as we mentioned previously. But the traditionalist samurai faction had hoped to maintain the shogunate, which was their bread and butter. This would be called the Northern Alliance, and they would be defeated militarily very quickly on the Japanese mainland. But the alliance would fracture, and there were some holdouts, which would be led by Admiral Enomoto Takeaki, who had one last trick up his sleeve, pulling a Taiwan.
Right. It's funny talking about the comparisons to China here. So let's talk about that. So eventually, like we said, these evicted samurai would briefly turn the island of Hokkaido into their kind of last stand, which then would drag the island inevitably into the Japanese orbit in ways that it had for the final time, really allowing for the complete integration of Hokkaido into Japanese society.
Right. So most of Wajinchi, that is the Matsumai domain on Hokkaido, would be under their control by the end of 1868. And they hoped that they would be a holdout for long enough to win Western support. And to that end, they got the bright idea of taking on a Republican sheen. So the notables of
It's really funny.
So the notables of the samurai were given the floor to vote, and they decided that Enomoto, the admiral, would become their president, even though he won only 156 out of 856 ballots cast.
Yeah, just curious. Do you know, did everyone else receive even fewer votes, or is this just a blatant, refusal to accept the election? What do you think happened
The
here?
book I consulted on this doesn't say. John, do you have more clarity on the situation to offer, maybe?
About the so-called republic?
So I this is, not grounded in anything concrete. It's just my own view. I think that he was just sort of agreed upon as maybe the best figurehead of the Republic of Ezo for numerous reasons, maybe not because of military success, but he sort of had the closest claim to having some kind of real connection with the winning side. In particular, it's sort of notable that, rather than coming from, either one of these dispossessed Ronin groups or one of these peripheral Choshu or Satsuma domains we'd alluded to, Takeaki was actually like a member of the Tokugawa. And so if there's going to be any guy,
the Tokugawa family,
exactly,
not the government, the clan, the clan around the country,
and so as a member of the clan, which was the representative of the former powers, my own thought is maybe this is the best guy to pick if you want to call a truce and sort of bring in. And I think this is a testament to the fact that he is one of the few members of the sort of losing side who had a place in the Meiji government after the Republic of Ezo was defeated.
Yeah, it's amazing they didn't hang him for this. Yeah, but before we go on, I just want to say that this really gets to what I think is the great irony of the Meiji Revolution in Japan. This great oxymoron, which is that if you look at the two sides of the conflict here, you have the new Meiji government in Honshu, which is proclaiming to be a re-entrenchment of feudal authority, but really seems to be this basically a bourgeois revolution in progress. In contrast, you can see that Ezo is proclaiming itself to be a Western-style republic, but really it's run by essentially a monarch from the previous ruling family. I think that's very funny to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of doubly ironic.
Yeah, so let's get into Enomoto himself. He really was a fascinating figure.
Yeah, he was one of those Dutch learning guys, and much more directly of a Dutch learner than someone like Moriyama.
Yeah, so he became the head of the traditionalist faction, looking out for the material interests of the previously dominant, now dispossessed samurai. But he was a very modern man in many ways. He had studied the naval sciences in Holland for 5 years. He was fluent in Dutch, and he was a very strong proponent of modernizing the military. Enomoto was also very skilled in framing his grievances in the Western mode, hence why he decided that he would create the Republic of Ezo. Here's a quote from Mark Ravina's To Stand with the Nations of the World, which I found very illuminating and shows just how skilled Enomoto was.
Yeah, it said, Enomoto's core grievance was that Yoshinobu's surrender had ignored many Tokugawa vassals, leaving them as ronin, former samurai without support. Enomoto requested control over the island of Ezo as compensation for those lost stipends and holdings. But when addressing the foreigners, Enomoto situated his grievance in the context of global political change. The governments of Asia suffered from a chasm between ruler and the ruled, leading to anger and resentment. The situation in Japan was merely an example of that pervasive problem, and would be resolved once the new government allowed the rebels to communicate directly with their sovereign. Foreign arbitration, Enomoto declared, could give the rebels access to their emperor, prevent an internecine war, and allow Japan to establish what he called a civilized government. Unlike the leaders of the Northern Alliance, Enomoto was able to recast his grievances, therefore, with cosmopolitan discourse.
Yeah, great stuff, but it was all for naught, really. The West was not about to back such a small faction, so by April, the imperial forces landed on Hokkaido, and they would overwhelm the samurai by the end of June. The Ezo Republic, however, brought the Ezo question back to the fore. Once again, a threat to Japan emanated from the northern island, and so old thoughts about what was to be done with the island that would now become Hokkaido began to be explored again. Now, Iwakura Tomomi, the guy we mentioned at the top of this section, would be central to this effort. He was really a modernizer who looked to the West, and to that end, he saw that Japanese ascent to modern civilization would be brought about by securing its domain, developing its tax system, and joining the colonial club through its own mission civilisatrice. So Ezo would prove to be central to all three of these goals.
Right, and that's what gives us this famous quote, at least famous in Japan, which is present in basically every book about the colonization of Hokkaido that we read for this. This is what's known as the Iwakura Proposal, basically the articulation of a Japanese version of Manifest Destiny. It specifically applies to Hokkaido, formerly Ezo, but kind of hints at the projection of Japanese power abroad that would have enormous consequences on people in continental Asia and in maritime Southeast Asia, really kind of paving the way for Japanese imperialism here.
Right. So to read from it, we entrust the governor to perform admirable service to this development enterprise and to spread civilization widely, making Ezo into a small Japan. In this way, in addition to generating unprecedented profits, we will stop the Russians from watering at the mouth. We must do our all to enhance the empire's power abroad. Whether we open Ezo or not will determine the future of the empire, and gentlemen serving the imperial court should devote every effort to this project.
Can I add something? I think, just because of there's sort of layers of irony upon historical irony here. In this quote in the Iwakura proposal, they use this phrase, whether we open Ezo or not, which is extremely reminiscent of how Perry's arrival is described. Or it's always compared to as the opening of Japan. And I really liked your observation, Liam, that the sort of colonization takes place in full force after the Republic of Ezo is crushed. Yeah. And I think it's very ironic that the sort of pivotal final conflict between these two forces in the Civil War ends with the Battle of Hakodate, in which a crucial role is played by Japan's first ironclad ship. It was known as the Kotetsu at the time. Yeah. So this really does feel like a kind of historical echo.
Yeah.
Imperial Japan has arrived.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why it's so interesting that basically, in a sense, is Hokkaido not the first colony of the Japanese Empire?
I think, it's arguably the most crucial, certainly, I think, among the first.
Right. And so, as we mentioned, so Japanese power had existed in Hokkaido since the 1500s, but really in 1869, it legally becomes part of Japan. Japanese troops are already occupying it to take out the Ezo Republic. So now they have the pretty difficult task of, in their view, of subjugating and, in their view, civilizing the entire island and all of its people. This would be a huge undertaking for Japan that really the Japanese state capacity was not able to do at this point. But due to this, echoing this Iwakura proposal, it was widely understood that making Hokkaido this new Japan was an absolutely essential goal of the new Meiji government. Partially because all of the potential modernizing changes that could happen in Japan could begin in Hokkaido. Hokkaido could be the test run for new types of schooling, new economic changes, new methods of agricultural science being brought in. Next episode, we're going to talk a lot about what that transformation actually looked like. But to end today, I think that we should talk about one guy in particular who was super essential to seeing these changes through, to turning Iwakura's proposal into a reality. He is one of the most colorful figures I've seen in Japanese history. He also is one of the only people with, I would say, real-life anime hair, and that being the future Japanese prime minister, then colonial commissioner, Kuroda Kiyotaka. Any thoughts on this guy before we dive in, John?
Again, unfortunately, I didn't know much about him prior. I do think it's interesting that he was the prime minister in the sort of immediate years preceding the Chinese-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese War.
Yes,
which I think is maybe the first the first real sort of aggression that's taking place. But unfortunately, I don't know much about him. I was just trying to do a little reading prior. One thing I think is sort of interesting, though, is that apparently he was actually involved in the Nanamugi incident, which we were discussing previously, which, basically he is one of the people who was running swords through Richardson during the Richardson affair.
And so he has a reputation today of being this incredibly brutish guy. He was known to be a very violent alcoholic, which is really part of kind of his legacy in Japanese cultural memory today. And most infamously, he was even accused, probably wrongfully, of killing his wife. She died under mysterious circumstances not long before he became prime minister, and rumors that he had murdered her, beaten her to death in a fit of rage, would plague him for the rest of his life.
Yeah, so all of his efforts to colonize the island, which by all accounts were very successful, were marked with incessant graft to line his own pockets. So very American in that sense as well. Really the perfect man to bring the Americans into Hokkaido.
Yeah. So he was this, and really, so he kind of was everything wrong, or I guess he was the worst of the New Japan. He was this, brutal colonizer in a sense who had seen the brutality of the Americans and the British firsthand. Like you said, John, he was part of the incident. He was one of the guys running swords through, and so he was directly involved in kind of seeing. He witnessed the bombing of the bombardment of Kagoshima by the British. So now he basically decided, let's do this same thing to the Ainu. Let's, if you can't beat them, join them. Let's do colonization ourselves by beginning with this violent colonization and subjugation of the Ainu people of Japan. One thing we should mention that's really interesting, kind of pointing towards our next episode, is that not only was he essential in kind of, leading campaigns against the Ainu and eventually bringing in many Japanese settlers, but part of his inspiration for his strategy here was when he visited the Russian island of Sakhalin briefly, which actually in 1869, the Japanese did not yet know that it was part of Russia or had been claimed by Russia. Can you talk about this, Sam?
It would really be a while before Japan and Russia would sit down and actually cement the border between themselves. But from what I understand, like there was some
it
Japanese...
also moved.
I'm sorry?
Oh, can you explain that, John?
Well, I mean, this border was somewhat contentious, I think.
Yeah.
What I know about Kuroda, was that he thought that Sakhalin was basically up for grabs. But then when he visited, to his shock and horror, he saw that Russia had already beaten them to Sakhalin by establishing a penal colony. This would be very important to the history of Hokkaido, because this penal colony, which housed a lot of Russian dissidents, including some radical communists, would become a model for the Japanese settlement of the neighboring Hokkaido. So basically what was happening was that when the Russians put these penal colonies on places like Sakhalin, not only were they getting rid of disruptive criminals like, communists and anarchists especially, but they were basically establishing a power base where these prisoners could work the land in ways that would earn a profit for the Russians and increase and also in a sense, each prison would serve as kind of a de facto military base because they would be patrolled by guards and soldiers. This was a great inspiration to Kuroda, who thought that he could bring this kind of policy to Hokkaido. Hokkaido had been a place of exile for Japanese people before, and it would now become this great place of imprisonment. And this really now finally brings us back to Golden Kamuy, as really what really gets that manga going is the idea of this Japanese treasure that all these former prisoners are trying to find. You can see, have all these Japanese people being brought to Hokkaido in the 1860s and 70s when it's still a very untamed place. The way they might have feared this new country, you can see like a kind of a romance that might have sprung up around this kind of exile.
Well, I think it's interesting, especially, right, because you have all these figures who, on the one hand, you have both like sort of settler colonists, people who are coming not necessarily to make money as tenant farmers, but, to get in on the fur trade or sort of exploit this, what they view as virginal land that they can take from the Ainu. And then on the other hand, you have these people being forcibly brought by the Japanese government there to serve as, penal convict workers. The thing is that because Japan had sort of so late begun its colonization of Hokkaido, there was this real desperate need for laborers, and they were sort of going to be worked in whatever conditions they could. So I knew less about Kuroda, but there's, I think, a similarly interesting contemporary figure I can mention. I don't know if the
please,
time is
by all
good.
means.
Well, so I think it fits with this sort of theme of the new government trying to learn from maybe American experts, because in this case, this figure, Kaneko Kentaro, who was a member of the parliament, actually, he got his law degree from Harvard Law School. He was literally a clerk of Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes before coming back and conferring with Kuroda, who had these ideas of, oh, wow, prison laborers seem to work really well on Sakhalin. How can we make that work here? And Kentaro was the person, sort of in the nitty gritty of kind of throwing these people into the meat grinders. So in particular, he was the person that very strongly argued for the legality of the penal convict workforce, even when there was this sort of absurdly high fatality rate associated with the work. The work was just so brutal that it was hard for the government to even keep track of the numbers of casualties as people were working. There was all kinds of work, whether it came from trying to lay road or train tracks as you're trying to connect these different kind of towns and nodes across the island, trying to mine precious resources, especially sulfur. There's this great, or maybe horrifying quote from Kentaro, which is actually repeated by one of the characters who was a former penal colonist. He says, "These prisoners are all violent and wicked men to begin with. So if they did hard labor as punishment, it would be a fine way to save money. And if they should die in the process, that would mean less cost for the prisons."
Wow.
And so the real irony is that many of these people were, some number of the people were, maybe what you might consider violent criminals, but an enormous majority of them were people who had either committed some kind of small misdemeanor, or worse, were, as Liam was alluding to, either, political prisoners of various stripes. Either they were political radicals or just, the losers in the Boshin War. So, you lose your civil war, and then you spend the rest of the short remainder of your life mining sulfur on Mount Eel. It's a, real humiliation. Yeah.
And so just kind of wrapping up here. So the establishment of these penal colonies would be such a great source of labor and capital in a weird way, an unexpected way for the new colony of Hokkaido. But there would also be two other sources of settlement in very, very different ways. First, they would bring in samurai as local gentry, often bringing on their former peasants in tow. And these villages would be set up in Hokkaido by these samurai clans, and the deal would be their former peasants would be liberated from any kind of bonds of service, but the deal would be that they would form these militias under the tutelage of their former samurai lords to defend from the Ainu. I don't know too much about these militias, but from what I understand, they are a really big part of the kind of Japanese self-conception of the history of Hokkaido. This idea of these self-reliant settler groups that would often violently conquer and basically commit a genocide against the people of Hokkaido. Obviously, this has very interesting resonance with American history, but also it does briefly figure in Golden Kamuy, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have these sort of various small frontier towns, being established or intruding onto, the Ainu kotans, the villages that you talked about a bit last time. But I don't think there are many sort of militia characters in the story. If I were to sort of describe them, I would say the main actors are maybe the Ainu, the convicts, and then maybe this sort of breakaway members of the military. Occasionally they run into some, sort of independent people, but they tend to just be like various kind of peasants or bandits or robbers.
Yeah.
Rather. So.
And also, settling the samurai would hopefully, deal with the dissatisfaction of the same guys that set up the Ezo Republic, And And so I wonder, I assume that a lot of these samurai involved in these militias probably were already there in Ezo, right? They were probably some of the guys involved in the Ezo Republic now being told, okay, hey, you can still keep your weapons, you can still keep your land here, but just fight the Ainu instead of fighting our government.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I think some of them were, but it doesn't seem even like it was necessarily a majority. Many of those people did end up just as political prisoners. I maybe they were sort of given a choice. You you can be this kind of paramilitary, or you can be a laborer.
Right. We'll get into this more in the next episode, I think, but this was a period of time when Japan was really starting to engage with a lot of Western discursive opinions. And among that was also this Malthusian idea that there's only so much, there are only so many people that could be settled in any place. So if you want to stave off the social problems that come with having these idle people around who have nothing better to do than to sow chaos in the hopes that they'll get something coming their way, it's better to just put them in the service of the imperial project and to ship them off to Hokkaido, as the Russians had already demonstrated with their own settling of the Far East.
You're right.
Absolutely.
All right, and so we have to mention, as to wrap this up, and also point towards the future plot developments in Golden Kamuy and next episode. We mentioned how some of the settlers coming to Hokkaido would be samurai, others would be prisoners, some would be samurai and prisoners, but there would be a third source of settlers as well, possibly the most unexpected source possible, given the ethos of the Restore the Emperor and Expel the Foreigners movement that led to, in a roundabout way, this colonization. Because many people migrating to Hokkaido in the 1870s, especially, thousands of them were in fact foreigners. Mostly, but not entirely, Americans, believed to be experts in agriculture or other fields very relevant to colonization, who could assist the Japanese government as employees on temporary contracts. Some of them for a few months, others for decades, for their entire lives, living on Hokkaido, working for their own enrichment, but also really for the benefit of Japanese civilization.
Right. So in this way, Sonojoy became a revere the emperor and learn from the barbarians.
Yeah, not expel them. No, yeah. It's no. And again, did they even really restore the emperor? Like, who's to say? I don't think the emperor was really that much more powerful than under the shogun. It was just he had changed hands, and now instead of expelling the foreigners, they're inviting way more foreigners than had been there before. But there is a fundamental difference, which was that these foreigners, although the principle of extraterritoriality did still apply, surprisingly, they were working for Japan on Japanese payroll, not for their own, just for their own profit. And really, the idea was that they were working for the benefit of all Japanese people, obviously excluding the Ainu. And so we're going to talk about some of these guys next episode. It's really interesting, but this was just a huge social transformation in Japan that really had great impact on Japanese exposure to foreign knowledge and really connected Japan to the global economy, or rather the European economy, in the later 19th century. So about 3,000 people would settle in Hokkaido, which from America and Britain and Germany, which isn't that many, but we have to mention that when you combine them with the other advisors in Tokyo and elsewhere, 1/3 of the entire Japanese government's expenditure in 1874 was paying their salaries. This was a huge undertaking of the Japanese state. It was one of the, just like the colonization of Hokkaido, it was one of the major projects of the new Meiji government. And that, I think, is a pretty good place to leave off, just because it points us toward next episode, leading towards how eventually the colonization of Hokkaido would lead to competition over Hokkaido with the Russians, which brings us straight to Golden Kamuy. Any more thoughts tonight, John? This has been going on for a while. This has been really fun. Really love to know if you and Russia Sam have any kind of closing thoughts on this matter.
I mean, maybe my brief thought would be to come back to the purported topic. I'd really strongly encourage people to try and give this a read, because
yes, it's very fun.
There's all of this history we can get into, and this is sort of just looking at the setting, we're not even quite in the setting yet. But I think it does touch on these things in a lot of interesting ways. Maybe one American advisor I'll mention, who was the agricultural advisor for Sapporo, who you should enjoy a can of maybe while you're listening to this. Edwin Edwin Dunn is both a large maybe very kind of villainous figure in the colonization of Hokkaido. It was sort of almost single-handedly responsible for the extinction of the Ezo wolf. But also is a figure in this story. He plays a small but sort of important role in one of the story arcs, and this is just one of the various rabbit holes that the story goes down into.
And we're going to talk about Edwin Dunn next week. But one more thing we should mention just so you guys know, I think it's very important here, is that not only did he have such an important impact on the development of Japan, but he had a really important impact, possibly even more destructive, on American history as well. You know this, John?
No, not familiar.
No, because his descendants, who were half Japanese, would eventually move back to the United States. And his great-great-grandson would go on to form the band 21 Pilots.
Oh, no.
I didn't know that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. This has been awesome. I can't wait to continue this talk really, really soon. You're so right about Golden Kamuy. It's really fun. I'm like a dabbler in manga and anime. I think way more than the average person, but I'm not like a full-on weeb. But man, this is bringing me back. Like this is a great one. Everyone should check out Golden Kamuy. A guy gets his face ripped off by a bear. Come on, man. That's like in the 4th chapter. You got to read it. It's really, really fun. So interesting, both as a kind of as a work of fiction and also as a kind of statement on history. So yeah, definitely check it out. Thank you so much, John. I really, really had a blast today.
Well, I'm happy to be maybe the official Gladio Free Euro weeaboo correspondent. And so, if it means dragging Sam into this further, that's something I'll do.
Well, you can certainly try. Many have failed, but maybe you'll crack this nut finally.
All right, well, have a great one, man. This has been awesome. Sayonara.